Buddy. Good evening, grade threes. I trust that you are well, and thank you very much for joining our class today. All right, so we are going to do English. We are basically doing the lesson of English, and for today's lesson, we're going to do adjectives that tells us what kind and how many, right? So before we start our lesson, you're going to go onto the A plus students.ca page, and then you are going to log in, and you're going to log in with your username as well as your password, right? So once you've logged in with your username as well as your password, we are going to select the subject of language arts. All right, so once we have selected the subject of language arts, we are going to select grade 3, right? So now we're going to select grade 3. Okay, so once you've selected grade 3, we're going to go to the chapter of adjectives. Today we are focusing on adjectives, right? And the lesson that we will be covering today is, does the adjective tell us what kind or how many? Then we're also going to identify the adjective that describes the noun as well as identify the adjectives, right? All right. So we are doing the chapter of adjectives, and the lesson is, does the adjective tell us what kind or how many? We're going to identify the adjectives that describes the nouns as well as identify adjectives, right? All right, so before we go on to our tutorial lessons, right, an adjective describes a noun. It describes a noun such as people, it can describe places, it can describe things, or it can even describe objects, right? And an adjective can either tell us what kind or it can tell us how many, right? So before we come back to the different examples of what kind and how many, let us go to the tutorial page, right? So we are going to first choose we're going to do the first lesson of, does the adjective tell us what kind or how many, right? All right. So once again, an adjective is a word that tells you about a noun, right? And some adjectives will answer the question of what kind, or you will find adjective that will answer the question how many, right? So it's the same as you asking a question what kind, or you ask the question of how many. Now that is the same with an adjective, right? It describes, right? And with it describing, it will either tell us what kind or it will tell us how many, right? All right, so what kind, right? So some adjectives will answer the questions what kind. And an example of what kind is, if we look at the first question, right, or the sentence, it says, the small baby smiled. The small baby smiled. So the adjective that basically answers the question what kind is small, right? Because now it's asking us what kind of baby, right? It is a small baby, right? So remember, you need to also ask yourself, like, what kind, or does it answer the question how many? So in this case, the small baby smiled, right? So we are specifically answering the question what kind of baby, right? Because it describes the noun baby, right? And we are saying that the adjective is small. So the small baby smiled, right? So the adjective that describes the baby is small. All right. She carried heavy books. She carried heavy books, right? We need to choose the word that describes the noun, right? So books, right? So what kind of books did she carry, right? She carried heavy books, right? Heavy books. So that basically answers the question, what kind? And once again, an adjective is a word that tells us about the noun, right? And a noun, it basically names a person, a place, a thing, and in this case, an adjective also tells us about an object, right? All right. Then we also have some adjectives that answer the question, how many, right? So here it says, one baby smiled. So how many babies smiled? Only one baby smiled, right? So we can say one baby smiled. So one, it will tell us how many, right? So one describes the baby that smiled, right? So only one baby smiled. She carried some books, right? So how many books did she carry? She only carried some books, right? It doesn't tell us it doesn't tell us how many books really. It's like it doesn't say 5 books, 10 books. It does not say a lot of books, but it specifically says some books, right? So they could have said a lot of books, many books. They could have said 3 books, 5 books, 10 books. So instead of giving the number, you can also say some, right? Because it tells us the quantity, right? Or the amount of books that she carried, right? So if you can also identify that, then well done, right? So that is an adjective, right? And once again, an adjective, it's a word that tells us about a noun. And if we go back to our whiteboard, right, here it says an adjective, it describes a noun, such as describes people, it describes places, it describes things or objects, right? Like in the first example, we said the baby, which is describing people or a person, right? And we mentioned books, which can either be classified as things or objects, right? All right, so now if we look at our first question, if we look at the first question says we need to look at the adjective. Does it tell you what kind or does it tell you how many? Right? Remember what kind, um, it will tell you maybe like what kind of person, animal, not even animal, but what kind of person, place, thing, object it is, right? How many will basically tell us either the number, tell us how many, the quantity thereof, right? So in this case, we need to say, does it tell us about what kind or does it tell us how many? So 3 friends laughed together, right? Is it what kind of friends laughed together or how many friends laughed together, right? So the word in bold, three, does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? So 3 friends, does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? All right, so 3 basically tells us how many, right? Because it's telling us how many friends laughed together. So only 3 friends laughed together. All the 3 friends they laughed together. It tells us how many friends. 3 friends they laughed together, right? So which means that it tells us how many, right? And once again, yes, it's the adjective 3 tells us about the noun friends and it answers how many friends laughed together, right? Sit in the comfortable chair. Sit in the comfortable chair. Does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? Comfortable, right? Comfortable, does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? Comfortable chair. Sit in the comfortable chair. So chair is our noun, right? It describes the noun. Does it tell us what kind of chair or does it tell us how many chairs, right? All right. So if you said what kind of chair, then that is correct, right? Because here it's telling us what kind of chair. It is a comfortable chair, right? That tells us about the noun. Tells us about the noun, right? So it tells us what kind. It's a comfortable chair, right? All right, let's go to the next one that says the park has 3 slides. So three. So how many slides does a park have? Does it tell us how many or does it tell us what kind, right? 3 slides. Does it tell us how many slides there are or what kind of slides there are? 3 slides. What kind or how many? All right, so if you said how many, then that is correct, right? Because it tells us how many slides there are, and there are 3 slides, right? So the park has 3 slides. So somebody would maybe ask, how many slides does this park have? It has 3 slides, right? So if you said how many, then that is correct, right? So this adjective, it tells us how many, right? So the adjective 3, it tells us about the noun slides and it answers the question how many slides the park has, right? All right, so if we quickly go to our the whiteboard, right? Here it says our adjective, it tells us what kind and it also tells us how many, right? And usually if the adjective or a few example of adjectives that will tell us what kind, then it will maybe use words like beautiful, kind, comfortable, uncomfortable, ugly, happy, honest, right? So this can maybe describe a beautiful dress. So what kind of dress, right? It's a beautiful dress, right? A kind person, right? So what kind of person, right? She is kind, right? An ugly, we don't want to say ugly person, right? But an ugly thing or chair, right? So what kind of chair, right? It is an ugly chair. It describes the noun, which is chair, right? A happy dog, right? So it tells us what kind of dog, which is maybe a happy dog. An honest girl. So the girl is being honest. So honest girl. What kind of girl? She's an honest girl, right? Then also we have adjectives that tells us how many, right? And it can either be a few something, or little, or there is no tomatoes, enough, something, or you can also give the number like 3, 5, 7, 3 girls, 7 apples, right? It will tell us how many, right? So that is adjectives that tells us what kind as well as how many, right? So let us quickly go and do a little test. And does the adjective tell us what kind or how many? All right, so if we look at the first one, right, it says you need to look at the adjective in bold Does it tell you what kind or does it tell you how many? So we need to follow the 5 rules. Follow these 5 rules. Does 5 tell us what kind or does 5 tell us how many? So 5, does it tell us what kind or does 5 tell us how many? Remember, an adjective, it describes the noun. Does it tell us what kind of rules or does it tell us how many rules we need to follow? All right, so if we say how many rules, because it tells us 5, so how many rules? 5 rules that we need to follow. One sock is missing, right? Does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? One sock is missing. Does it tell us what kind of sock is missing or does it tell us how many socks are missing? All right, so yes, it is telling us how many because it's only telling us one sock. How many socks? Only one sock is missing. So well done. Cotton spent spent $15. So Carlton spent $15. Carlton spent $15. Does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? 15. Does it tell us what kind of dollars Carlton spent or how many dollars Carlton spent? Right? So let us quickly choose the first option, right? So what kind and what kind is incorrect, right? Why is what kind incorrect? Because firstly, it tells us what kind, um, the adjective 15, right? It tells us about the dollars and it also tells us how many dollars Carlton spent, right? It tells us how many dollars Carlton spent, not what kind of dollars Carlton spent. So remember, if you get anything incorrect, right, then it will take you back to the tutorial as well as the questions and answers that we did, and it will then basically tell you how you need to do it, right? So in this case we chose what kind, which was incorrect, and they basically corrected it for us. So Carlton spent $15, which tells us how many dollars Carlton spent, right? All right, so if we now go back to our next lesson, which is to identify the adjective that describes the noun. Now we're going to have to identify the adjective that describes the noun, right? An adjective, once again, is a word that tells you about a noun, right? And we said that some adjectives can either answer questions of what kind, and some adjectives can answer questions like how many, right? And remember, we said what kind um, can either tell us small baby, can tell us heavy baby, an honest person, beautiful, right? It tells us what kind of person, place, or thing, or even object it is, right? And then how many is usually a number or quantity, some, few, many, a lot, right? Nothing, one, two, three, right? Any amount that will tell us how many, right? Okay, so if we look at our first question, right? It says we need to select the adjective that tells us how many, right? So Franklin has several, that's supposed to be several reasons to stay home, right? Here is the correct word. So Franklin has several reasons to stay home. We need to choose the correct adjective that tells us how many, right? And remember, you also need to identify the noun within that sentence, right? And then once you choose the correct adjective, you also need to say what it describes or tells us about what. So Franklin has several reasons to stay home, which means that the adjective that we are going to choose is several, because several tells us how many reasons Franklin has to stay home, right? So several is the adjective, right, that tells us about the noun, which is reasons, right? And it tells us how many reasons Franklin has to stay home. All right, we have the next one. Emma sang a pretty song. So Emma sang a pretty song. We need to select the adjective that tells you what kind, what kind. So Emma sang a pretty song, right? So the noun, first identify your noun, and in this case, the noun is song, right? So song, what describes the noun? What tells us about the noun, right? We need to identify the adjective that tells us what kind. So pretty, yes, pretty is correct, right? Because pretty is the adjective that tells us about the noun, which is song, right? And tells us what kind of song, right? She sang a pretty song. So if you said pretty, then that is correct. Cassie will wear a fancy hat in the parade. Cassie will wear a fancy hat in the parade, right? We need to select the adjective that tells you what kind, right? So, what kind? By identifying also what the noun is, and also then the word that either tells us what kind of noun it is, right? Or describes the noun by telling us what kind. All right, so if we choose fancy, right? So fancy is then the adjective that describes the hat, right? So it will tell us what kind of hat does Cassie wear for the parade or in the parade. She wears a fancy hat in the parade. So fancy, it tells us about the noun, which is hat, and it will tell us what kind of hat Cassie wears, right? Once again, these are a few examples. It tells us how many, and it also tells us what kind. You see, even if you look at this example that we did on how many, several, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be one, two, three, and give a specific number. Several also tells us about how many, right? All right. If we go back and we go to our next lesson, which is to identify adjectives, right? So in our second lesson, we did identify the adjective that describes the noun. Now we are going to identify the adjectives, right? And remember, an adjective, it describes a noun, right? It either tells us about or describes a person, it either describes a place, a thing, or it describes an object, right? And we do not select any of the articles, right? An article is not an adjective, right? So a, an, or the, we do not select any articles whenever we select the adjectives, right? So an article is not an adjective, or we do not select an article when we select an adjective, right? All right, so if we go to our first one that says Josh has four brothers. So Josh has four brothers. We need to choose or select the adjective within the sentence. Josh has four brothers. All right, so brothers is the noun, right? And now four, it tells us the number of brothers that Josh has, right? So which means that the adjective is four and it tells us about the noun brothers, right? It tells us how many brothers Josh have, right? So Josh has four brothers. So how many brothers? Four brothers, right? All right, we need to select adjectives, two adjectives. The cold rain fell for 3 days. So the cold rain fell for 3 days. We need to select two adjectives within the sentence. The cold rain fell for 3 days, right? You must also maybe say if it's telling you what kind or if it's telling you how many, right? And also try and select the nouns. So the cold rain fell for 3 days. All right, so if we now select our two adjectives, right? The first one is cold, right? So the adjective cold, it describes or tells us about the noun rain, right? So what kind, right, of rain? The cold rain. And it fell for 3 days. So three is the other adjective, right? And it tells us how many days. So the first one, cold, it tells us what kind of rain, right? So this one, it tells us what kind. Oopsie. Tells us what kind. And this one, which is three, it tells us how many. So the cold rain fell for 3 days. So cold and three. Cold tells us what kind of rain, and three tells us how many days, right? So that is the two adjectives that describes the nouns, right? And remember, we said a and the. It we don't use that or we don't select those when we talk about describing, or we don't select it when it's an adjective or as an adjective. The tree has many blossoms. So the tree has many blossoms. We need to choose the correct adjective within that sentence. The tree has many blossoms. All right, we can then choose many, right? Because many will tell us how many, right? Many tells us how many. So the adjective is many and it tells us about the noun blossom. It tells us how many blossoms does the tree have, right? It has many blossoms, right? And that is many is the adjective and it tells us about the noun blossoms. All right. All right, so now we're going to do a little test where we are going to identify the adjective, right? And also the adjective that describes the noun. All right, so we need to select the adjective, and once again, do not select any articles, right? We do not select any articles which is a, and, or, the, right? That is not an adjective, right? So the town has three banks. The town has three banks. We need to choose or select the correct adjective within that sentence. Is it town or is it three? Is it town or is it three? We need to select the correct adjective within that sentence. All right, so three, right? It tells us how many banks there are in that town. All right, we're going to the next one. The next one says several beavers built the dam. So several beavers built the dam. We need to choose the correct adjective that describes a noun within that sentence. Is it built or is it several? Built or several, right? So several beavers built the dam. All right, so we have several, right, which describes or tells us how many beavers built the dam. Well done. If you have that one. We saw some buffaloes. We saw some buffaloes. We need to select the correct adjective, right? Is it saw or buffaloes? Saw or buffaloes? Saw or some, sorry. Saw or some. That describes the noun, right? All right. Some, right? If you said some, then that is correct. So well done to the ones who said some, right? I like black beans. I like black beans is our adjective like or is our adjective black. I like black beans, right? Is our adjective like or is the adjective black? What does it describe? Does it tell us how many or does it tell us what kind, right? All right. So for those of you who said black, that is correct because it tells us what kind of beans, right? All right, we're going to do the last one, which says they opened five windows, right? Remember, we do not select any articles, right? We do not select a and other. They opened five windows. Is it they or is it five? Does it tell us what kind or does it tell us how many? All right, so somebody mentioned five, right? So five describes how many windows were opened, right? And then you are then going to do the rest of the tutorial questions or the test questions on your own, right? And remember, we need to identify or select the adjective, and we do not select any articles. You do not select a, you do not select an, and you do not select the because it does not describe a noun, right? All right, so that was the lesson now on does the adjective describe what kind or how many. And remember, we said an adjective, it describes the noun, describes either or tells us about people, places, things, or even objects, right? And the adjectives can either tell us how many or it can tell us what kind, right? And remember when we say what kind can describe either maybe beautiful, black, ugly, happy, honest, right? Or how many can either give us an X amount of numbers, can either mention things like several, few, little, right? Those are all the examples of adjective that tells us what kind or how many, right? All right, so now let's go over to our A plus classes.ca. So you're gonna go onto a new tab and type in A plus classes.ca. All right, and then once you are on A plus classes.ca, let's go to learning materials. Let's go to reading. Then we're gonna scroll right down to the reading, right? And then we're gonna choose there are one, two, three, four boxes that you'll see, purple boxes. And then we are going to do the read along audiobook. So not the first, second, third, but we are going to go to the fourth one, right? Which is read along audiobooks level 2, right? Because we are grade 3. So we're going to the level 2 book. So click on start. All right. Okay. So you can then either say you're a kid, parent, or both, or to let's just go back rather and let's rather just go to the audio books, right? The adapted mind you can basically do on your own, right? And then if you do it on your own as the child, you can say kid. If your parent is with you, then you can maybe just say the parent, or you can choose both you and the parent, right? So rather, let's go back to read along audiobook level 1. So we're rather going to stick to audiobook level 1, right? All right, so since it is the 4th of July, we are going to read aloud the 4th of July, right? And this is an audio book where you are basically just going to follow and also read along. However, it's going to be a read aloud audio book. All right, so we're just going to follow. All right, so that is an audiobook on the 4th of July, right? And it's a celebration that certain parts of the country celebrates. And they basically told us all the things that you can do basically as a family on the 4th of July. July, right? So you can even go back and identify things that it's basically fun activities that they do on the 4th of July, right? So maybe in your spare time, you can then write down ways in which you and your family can also have fun, right? Either on the day of the 4th of July or any other day that is maybe in your country a specific holiday, right? Or where you guys celebrate, or a weekend, or even now that is vacation, right? All right, so grade three, that is now the end of our lesson, right? That is the end of the lesson on adjectives, right? And just to recap on our lessons on adjectives, right? We did does the adjective tell us what kind or how many? We identified adjectives that describes the nouns as well as identified adjectives, right? And remember, we said adjective that tells us how many is it's usually a number, or it will tell us several, or it will tell us many or lots or few, right? And what kind will maybe tell us either it is big, small, comfortable, uncomfortable. It will basically describe the noun, and the noun, it names a place, a person, a thing, or even an object, right? So that is the end of the lesson on the chapter adjective. Thank you very much for joining our class today, and I really hope that you it was informative and that you learned about adjective and how to identify or use adjectives, right? So thank you very much for joining the class. Thank you. Goodbye.